there is again such interest in rapid response collecting. So I sit in a team that has a focus on architecture, design and digital. And my particular interest is product design. And rapid response collecting is the first output of this collections-based team. We have been in post since January of last year. And bear in mind that the museum is a place of more than 150 years of curatorial activity. We still feel very fresh-faced. So in being asked to do this talk, I thought, what title should I use? And so I thought, rapid response collecting at the V&A. That's exactly what I'm going to talk about. But I think there are a number of ways to think about this activity. And it will also in some way structure what I'm going to speak about this evening. So yes, rapid response collecting at the V&A. It could also be called the politics of things. This is a little bit about how people have reacted to this activity, but also potentially you might say how we are looking at the design world today. And then design and public life is another way to look at rapid response collecting. And it, as a title bespeaks, our team's wider and ongoing interests. So what is rapid response collecting? It's a new strand to the museum's collecting activities. You need to bear in mind, I still feel new, so these facts are quite interesting to me as well as you. We have about 8 miles of galleries in the museum. We're over 700 employees, of which more than 100 are curators. I'm staggered by this when I walk into work every day. But of those 100 plus curators, about 30 have an engagement with contemporary practice. That doesn't mean that they are solely focused on the contemporary. That's just the 4 of us who sit in the contemporary team. But there is a breadth of interest in contemporary practice, and indeed that speaks to the foundation of the museum, which was there to help makers create better things, to educate the consumer, when we were founded by Henry Cole, with a real, a strong social mission. So rapid response collecting, we have a dedicated gallery now. We have 5 showcases in amongst this vast institution dedicated to this new strand. We have been collecting under the aegis of rapid response for a year, and the space has been open for 3 months. And so that just gives you a wider context of where this activity sits. And so the most recent addition to our collection, or rapid response collecting activity, is this Lego set. It was an instant fit. So the way we work is that if an idea comes to us or we see something that draws our attention, we think, oh, that might be rapid response. We have an open plan office, as I'm sure many of you might as well, and we punt the ideas around. It was striking that this object immediately had a tick from a number, well, 3 of the 4 curators. So it's you will see there's a chemist, a paleontologist, and an astronomer. It's a Lego set that was launched in August via the Lego Ideas platform. So it's the first time that Lego has done crowdsourced design suggestions. They've had a similar thing in Japan, but this is a much more official thing. And you have to propose your ideas. You need to get 10,000 endorsements before it goes to a review panel. This set was suggested by Dr. Ellen, my Dutch pronunciation, I'm aware is poor, Koeman. And she said, as an adult fan of Lego, she realised that the representation of male and female figures was slightly askew, and also she was concerned about the representation of professional women. So this toy set went into manufacture, and it was sold out within 3 days. It didn't even make it to the shelves of Toys R Us or other similar larger retailers. And the thing for me that's so interesting here is that it's the first in the toy maker's 82-year history to show or to have women in a professional setting that is targeted at girls, that is not gendered. So the Research Institute, as it is known, fits very well into the V&A's collections. We have the Museum of Childhood as part of our larger group, but it's also something that's looking at new ways of generating interest and ideas in design. It's a crowdsourced thing, but in that sense you could say it's novel, which in some ways is something you might put in your justification for the acquisition of an object. But for us, and in particular for rapid response, this object is so important because it addresses pressing current issues. Role models for young girls, the question of gendered toys. I went to Hamleys only just to purchase a base plate for this, and I was once again really quite, it was like a field trip to go and look at all the toys. But it's also an object that addresses the questions, or can be used as a lens through which to look at the number of women entering science careers, which is, again, is something that's been much discussed and debated, and there are significant government initiatives both here and in the States to try and address this shortfall. So Lego Research Institute was launched, and within a short period of time, this Twitter feed, Lego Academics, it's really playful, and I really recommend you have a look at it. It captures some of these concerns that this designed thing brings out very directly. They now have more than 40,000 followers, and the 3 mini figurines are used to create scenes which depict the trials and tribulations of academic life. That they are women is just by the by. And Donna Yates, who herself is an archaeologist who has created this account, says, and I'm just going to read this quote here, "The bigger point is that we show women scientists going through this, and that's part of the excitement surrounding the Lego set and the account. Not just academic jokes, but the fact that these are female academics in normal academic situations being normal scientists." I think this is an important thing that we can address through a material object. So yes, rapid response is about bringing things into the museum in a timely fashion. So I approached Lego, I mean, I couldn't buy it, but we as a museum, then you realise also that you have the clout of the V&A behind you, approached Lego, and we were fortunate enough to be gifted this set into the collection. But it is, again, about concerns that shape how we live together that are often quite abstract or remote. So questions of gender, potentially, and how that has implications for all of us, can be addressed in the museum and situated around material fact. But it's also about the museum, in terms of us being a design institution, looking outward beyond the many pots that we have, or the many chairs. Should we buy more chairs? Should we buy more pots? Absolutely yes, but design practice today has changed. Authored design is only one aspect, or high-end design is only a very small sector of what we consider to be the designed world. And so rapid response is about being agile enough to respond to global events that shape and are shaped by changes or developments in design, manufacturing and technology, but also the more political, the economic or the social changes that also shape our lives, but also are articulated through architecture and urbanism, product design, digital design. So the other object that we have very recently included in the display is something that I think I imagine most of you will be in some way familiar with, but will not have been able to see it firsthand. And it's a digital project, so at first hand is always an open question, and maybe the digital is something that we can come back to in the discussion. But so it was one of the objects that really crystallized our thinking about rapid response collecting. So in May of last year, Texan law student Cody Wilson released the blueprint for the slightly provocatively or even boorishly named Liberator gun. It's a handgun, it's 3D printed, and it's fully operable. The BBC happened to catch him just as he was about to fire it for the first time, and this is what you see here. Within days, the US State Department had requested that he take the files down from his website, which is known as Defense Distributed. So my colleague Louise Shannon, who's the curator of digital, within a month, travelled to Texas to visit Cody in his studio to seek the acquisition of this object or to speak to him, because for us it was a seminal moment in contemporary design history. And so Louise went, selected the objects that we were to bring into the collection, but then we hit upon a problem that we hadn't anticipated, but we were very much not the only ones. The importation of a plastic firearm was beyond the legal frameworks that were in place this time last year. And so we needed or wanted to display this object as part of last year's design festival, because it was an acquisition made under a particular fund, the design fund, which it was not an insubstantial sum to acquire this object. But we couldn't actually get the object across the pond. So within 10 days of needing to put this 3D printed gun on display, we had to find somebody in London. And the company that agreed to do it, called Digits to Widgets, were very, very clear that they did not want to be seen as manufacturers of a firearm. They don't have a license, so that's also a question, is who's making what? And again, it provokes a discourse around 3D printing technologies. But they did, and for me, this is the richness of this object. They modified two things about the gun before they printed it. You can see we have two materials. Here, the white is the standard ABS plastic that Cody Wilson and his design specified. The grey is plaster. Now, plaster, as you all know, is a very, very brittle material, so it would never function as a firearm. But also, it was belt and braces. They changed the dimensions of some of the parts, so even we as a museum would never be able to put this together. This object is now part of our collections, but so in the last 2 weeks, the State Department in the US has got to a point where they have amended the law, and we now have the fired gun, the first Liberator to have been fired, on display in our rapid response collecting gallery. And I think it's interesting when we look at or consider that we've called this rapid response, but we've only managed to get this firearm into our display more than a year after this incident. And again, I think it has encouraged us to question what rapid response collecting is, but also to think more broadly about how objects are timely. I think rapid response does have this quality of newsworthiness about it, but when and how are things newsworthy, and how do those trajectories continue? And so it seems rather fitting that in the October issue of Wired, Ron Arad, who was one of the first designers to use 3D printing technology as a direct means of production in his work, is lamenting the fact that the V&A acquired this gun last year. But you could argue that this is an established designer who's still railing against the changed understanding that Cody Wilson's design brought about. I think much of the coverage has made this clear, but for us is that this 3D printed gun has forever changed how designers, but also the broader non-design public, understand 3D printing technology. There's been a lot of kind of techno-utopianism about what this new means of making might be. But it's about saying, actually, there are many applications for this technology, but also as a museum, the sinister object demands our attention just as much as the beautiful. And again, rapid response is one of those ways to bring a diversity of objects into the museum. So that's a series. So the first object that we're interested in, and the most recent to go into the gallery, just as two examples of how we're looking at these objects in the round. This is our modest gallery space. It's 5 showcases, but it is sandwiched between, on this side, the 20th century permanent displays, and on that side, if that makes sense, the late 20th and early 21st century displays. So long-standing displays of iconic, beautiful design. I mean, all collected with absolute rigor and an interest in the design and its process, but of a very particular ilk. And rapid response absolutely does sit counter to that. as the two objects that I've discussed in a little bit more detail make clear, they're material evidence of social, political, economic and technological change. They may be of modest value, but they are newsworthy very much because they give us a sense of what design can do, advances in design, but also the objects that can tell us the truth about how we might live together. I think a gun at the press of the button is one way to look at it, but the change in understanding of 3D printing technology, which is used, as I'm sure you're aware, in so many different arenas, is also really important. So we started a year ago in thinking about this, and we have set ourselves a target of collecting between 12 and 20 objects a year, which doesn't actually sound that many, but I realise now that we've been open for 3 months that we're not quite keeping pace. And again, it's a question about rapidity. It's not, and it is understood in both ways. Some think it's because we should be collecting things very quickly because these are areas of design that the institution may not have been looking at as attentively as it could have been. For us, it's very much not that. It's about this timely response. And the display, I mean, you can just about see each of the objects has a label with it, as most museum objects do, but we also have a date of when the objects entered the collection. And so it's about saying these objects came here, we want the discussions and the debates about these objects in the institution while they're still ongoing. And that's a way of looking at the museum that's, yes, we are a repository of things, but we're also a place of debate and discussion, and it's about bringing that to the forefront through this activity. As I've already alluded, 150 years, 1.5, there's quite a difference, but as a team of curators, so there's Kieran Long, who's our senior curator, and then we have a curator of architecture and urbanism, and Louise, who's our curator of digital. So the four of us, albeit quite small, have been really welcomed and given a great deal of latitude to think quite freely about what we're doing. It's rare, I think, that you get to take up a position or a job of this type where there's no predecessor. You've got no shoes to fill. You have a breadth and scope to think about what you want to do. And it is very much about the V&A also, in a wider sense, thinking about what is its role today as a museum of design. So in those terms, I think this photograph captures it quite nicely, because so you've got rapid response, but below you have the sculpture galleries. So these are the historic collections, which sit at a real disjuncture from, say, the virtual reality headset or the lift hoisting carbon fibre cable. But it's a difficult place to find in the museum, but it means I do think that you can look at our collections, and I say our collections, the historic collections, differently. Yes, we are interested in process when we look at our rapid response objects, but it also means that I think you might look and see if there's a reason for an object's acquisition that isn't its originality or its beauty or the fact that it's in the Louvre. So there might be a sinister story to one of the sculptures or some of the very ornate objects that we have in the British galleries. So it's about saying, how do we look at these objects? How do we value these objects? And rapid response is a very small kind of test of some of those ideas. Within the collection so far, we have this Motorola WT4000 wearable terminal. And again, this we've had in the collection since the middle of last year, when it came to our attention because a Tesco worker was reported in the press to say that he had been fired on the basis of not having been productive enough. So this is an object that uses quantified feedback to improve performance, just like your now defunct Nike fuel bands or your Fitbit or your Jawbone Up. But the performance is not a view of an individual, but of a business. It's an object that is quite, it looks quite strange. It's technologically, it's a Windows-based computer, but it's a working and daily reality for thousands of people. You and I take advantage of this when we order something via Amazon. because of course the hyper efficiency of the next day delivery has to be facilitated in some way, and designed objects are at the heart of that story. Another object, and this is the second real object around which rapid response collecting as an idea took shape. This is a pair of Primark cargo pants, which we bought on the London High Street. Well, I should actually take one step back. We bought a pair of jeans on the London High Street in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Rana Plaza factory in April of last year. It was the most significant disaster in the garment industry in recent times, and high street fashions that you and I are likely wearing tonight were made in this factory. The V&A is the national collection of fashion and textiles, and we should be in a position to speak about the garment industry in its broadest terms. For us, this is an object that can tell us about the global supply chain. Another object, so just to come back, so we bought these jeans. It's a really instructive one. We acquired these jeans, and I'll come back to this a little bit later as well, by going out to Stratford, the Olympic Park area, and buying a pair of jeans. We had seen a label in the rubble, the AP press photography. We'd followed the story closely, and we'd seen a picture of Primark jeans. And we went out and bought what we thought was a pair of identical trousers. And immediately we contacted Primark to ask whether they could confirm that the jeans that we had, which we were intending to acquire, were those that were made in Dakar. And they wrote back and said, this is the type of information that we don't disclose. It was quite firm, but not impolite. But we were determined, and we wrote to a number of organisations, including Labour Behind the Label, War on Want, the Bangladeshi Garment Workers Association, as a means to try and assure ourselves that we had bought the right thing. Each garment that you buy on the high street has a 7 or 8 digit number, which traces that garment back to its place of manufacture. But we couldn't get to that point, which for us was already instructive about how the things that cost £10 are made and the processes and chains that are therein. But once we press released that Rapid Response was opening as a display of our collecting activity, Primark did get in touch and said those jeans were made in Pakistan. And we were like, but then we were very fortunate that they were extremely collaborative in helping us source this pair of cargo pants, which even they cannot verify were made in the factory, but they absolutely know that this style was made in the Rana Plaza at the time of the disaster. And again, that's an interesting question if you're thinking of objects in terms of a museum and whether there should be, or what intensity of focus there should be on the provenance of an object. But for us, this is as close as we could get. We went through every source possible, and these jeans, in the richness of that story, but also now in the partnership and discussion that we have with Primark, can help us think about fast fashion and the global fashion market in a really different but also considered way. A number of the other objects we have, this is a particular favourite of mine. These are Christian Louboutin shoes. They were the Nudes collection. So he launched these in autumn last year, just called them Nudes. Within the fashion world, of course, nude is still very much understood as a specific colour, that of Caucasian skin. But somebody like Crayola changed their flesh-coloured crayon to peach in the 60s. But so beyond that question, which I think is very current, particularly as some keep reminding me, Kate Middleton is particularly fond of her nude shoes. These are £500 plus high heel shoes, but there are women of diverse ethnicities who now have a personal income to buy these shoes. So for me, this is a global economic story. And when you start to interrogate that a little bit more, you see that the mannequin arms, which we have made the effort to acquire as well, which I think our colleagues in the fashion section would probably not have done, because they enhance and widen this global narrative, because these shoes are sold in markets where it's culturally taboo to show certain parts of the female body. But of course, you have the need to show the skin match. So you get this slightly odd mix of shoes and hands. They also come with a dedicated app. And again, for us, this is newer insight into high fashion and online retail, because it's an app whereby you photograph your skin colour, it matches your skin colour to the appropriate tone. It doesn't actually take you through to purchase, but it personalises the online shopping experience. That said, when you speak to the Bhutan design team, they also say that particularly in China, but not solely in China, with it being such a mobile connected society, having an app is a real way to tie in the customer. Luxury brands that don't have that, which typically they have been slower to adopt, are not as popular. And again, for us, rapid response, it's about saying this is important and interesting in 2014, or this was 2013. So it's about enabling our collections to be interesting to our future researchers and our current visitors in different ways. And I think some of you will also be familiar about with our acquisition of the Katy Perry eyelashes. These were brought to our attention by a journalist, Gethin Chamberlain, who we had been in contact with about the Primark jeans. And I hadn't known, but these eyelashes are made from human hair that's individually knotted strand by strand to a thread. They're made by women in Indonesia earning the minimum wage. And again, for us, this is a way to connect a very, very anonymous woman working in particular circumstances to the most followed individual on Twitter. And again, this is an incredible piece of craft that can tell us about our shared existence, not just you and I or us in the UK, but how our choices on an everyday basis and how they spiral out into the wider world. So to come on to the second title of what this talk might have been, reactions and responses, and the politics of things is very fitting. There have been some lessons learnt in making this, or in developing this strand of collecting. The Katy Perry eyelashes and the jeans are interesting or noteworthy examples, but there are others too. I mean, I've already spoken about Ron Arad and his, not only his, but some in the wider design community's reticence in our collecting activity. I'm a little bit biased here. I was really thrilled that we had managed to create such discourse that some of our favourite publications also featured our work. But that said, I mean, it's been really staggering how much impact we've managed to have with 12 objects. But I think that's in part because what we're doing is so ideas-driven, and it's questioning what design is, but it's also questioning the role of the museum, but also the role of design in the museum. But that said, to be fair, all of the responses have not been as positive. And of course, debate, discussion is a very rich and positive thing. But this is an article that came out in the Sunday Times just before the display was to open. And it called us out as a team for collecting controversies and, you might say, wagging fingers. And it made a number of the companies that we were working with intensely nervous about what we were doing. And I think that's both healthy, but it also caused us some problems. I've already spoken about Primark. I mean, Primark became anxious because of the tone that the journalist took. I don't have an image here, but another object where some of the early coverage prior to opening the display caused some kind of friction, might be a good word to use. We've acquired a Vipe e-cigarette as well. And we were very, again, the reasons for that acquisition were that it was, so electronic cigarettes have been around since the 60s, but they really took off in the mid-2000s when a gentleman in Shenzhen in southern China managed to find a way to manufacture them in larger numbers. But, and I think you will all be aware that they are an ever-increasing presence. But British American Tobacco was the first big tobacco firm to enter the market in the UK last year with the Vape e-cigarette. And they put an advert on television in February of this year. And it was the first time in near 50 years since tobacco advertising had been banned in the UK that something of that nature was broadcast, albeit after the watershed. And so there were two things about Vape which were instructive to me. One was that, so I bought the cigarette independently, and then I approached the company so that we were able to show the advert in the display, because the reasons for acquisition are always part of how we talk about the objects in rapid response. And for me, the advert was really important. And in speaking to the company, you realise that because of the regulations around British television advertising and what you're allowed to show, the ad said for vapors, because you're not allowed to say smokers. But the company, in their brand management, were very clear that online, the ad said for smokers, because it's about how they position their product. To show that advert in the gallery, I had to go through a process of convincing them that it was a suitable place. They were concerned that it was an arena in which children might see the advert. And to me, it was clear that the V&A itself has smoking paraphernalia throughout its collections. But also, if you go to a contemporary museum or gallery, smoking is a very regular thing in the art world. And it's critically important to understand that the museum gallery environment is different to your front room. So once we had got past that hurdle, some of the early coverage meant that they thought, having thought that we were acquiring the object on the basis of its design, which we were, but it's how you understand acquisition into a museum. Is it the kind of benediction of something that is good, or is it about looking at these objects in the round? And I think there was a slight mismatch of expectation, despite my sense of having been quite clear. And the company were really quite upset with the context in which they thought they were being shown. I think when Primark came in to see the objects in the gallery, they were entirely reassured with how it was being displayed. I mean, our objects are shown, as you can see, with contextual information, but also we're clear that the tone and the information we provide is fact-based. This display and this activity is not there to say to our visitors, this is what you should think about globalization or the rights and wrongs of mass manufacture. It's about saying, these are the realities of today. Come here. You all come to our spaces with different viewpoints, but it's putting the facts out there and allowing our visitors' imaginations to run wild. In the way that we look at this pair of Primark trousers, we would hope also that if you go and look at a 17th century inlaid piece of furniture that has ivory and ebony within it, you would begin to think about that object in the round as well. So that said, the response once we've opened the display has been extremely heartening, and it's difficult for us to say whether we've been well visited or not, because it's a part of the permanent fabric of the museum. It's a thoroughfare, so yes, it might just be that people are going to look at the Alva Alto and Breuer furniture in the gallery next door. But there are a number of questions that I pose for myself here, and myself, by that I mean our team. This, hard as it might be to decipher, is an accelerator pedal used in the majority of Aston Martin's luxury sports cars. And at a point last year, they had to recall 17,000 of their cars. That was nearly all of those manufactured after 2007. And the problem was this part of the accelerator pedal that they found had been made with counterfeit DuPont plastics in Shenzhen. Whether the plastic was of a different quality to the DuPont plastic was not a factor. It was the fact that it was proven to be counterfeit. And for me, this was, again, an object that popped out the global supply chain. This is a luxury brand that very much aligns itself with national characteristics. Making things in China, everybody does, but it was perceived to have been a risk in that sense. They're now manufactured, these parts, back in the UK, but when I approached Aston Martin, they were in no way keen. They were very polite, but they were in no way keen for this object to have any foothold at the V&A. But I wonder if now that the display is open and the kind of approach the objects, the rigour with which we look at them, collect them, and try and speak about them might mean that they would have been more open to it having been included. Potentially that's still very naive, but it gives you an indication of where we see our activity. Another object, and this, so I mentioned earlier that rapid response collecting has now been open for 3 months. And that, again, for one reason, has changed how our collecting activity happens, in the hope that what we are doing is now very clear because there's a physical place to come and see it. But it also means that others are now suggesting objects. I think it would be great if any of you, when we have a chance to speak later, have suggestions to think through how we might consider whether that's something to acquire or not. But we were really fortunate not so long ago for Aaron Cope from the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum to come and speak, part of the Smithsonian. He came to speak about a related subject at the museum, and he said to us as a team, so the 9/11 memorial has just included a brick from Osama bin Laden's compound in their displays. Is this something that you would consider for rapid response collecting? And these are the types of objects that we discuss vigorously, and then we come to a consensus. It's still a very new activity, and we have to not be worried about making mistakes, but it also very much means that we're still learning, and what we think at a given moment in time may still change. I mean, we have been quite clear that we can articulate what rapid response collecting is as an activity, clearly, but there are no fixed strictures around what is an object that can enter the collection. I mean, that said, the design narrative within the object has to be there. It's paramount. So the way we acquire these objects is exactly the same as anything else in the museum. An Alexander McQueen garment is exactly the same to our senior colleagues as a set of Katy Perry eyelashes. We have to be able to say, why is this an object of design? Why is it suitable for the V&A collections? And beyond that, what makes it interesting to our particular sections collecting activities. So to come back to this brick, for me, yes, it's absolutely an important object, but the argument might be that it's more towards the social history as opposed to design, because where it was is what's interesting about that object. The interest does not reside in its designed form. So to come back to that, of course, at the moment we're very keenly watching the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong. And so we are newsworthy in the sense we do think, where might we find an object? But it has to be a designed thing. And we're currently pursuing an umbrella. I'm not sure if some of you have seen that. They have been very aware that there are aerial photographs of the protests being taken, but also drones are being flown. And so these umbrellas that are being used to protect from tear gas are also having slogans written on them. And that's something that we would think a very suitable and timely example of rapid response. But it's also a full year after we've acquired an IKEA soft toy. Just very briefly to explain a little bit more about the brick. This soft toy, he's called Lufsig. He's in the shape of a wolf. And on the 7th of December last year, he was on the flyer, the leaflet that brought you to this event. It's a toy. He is not animate. But I'm attached to him, as you can tell. I'm a curator in that sense. So Lufsig came to our attention because he was thrown in an act of political protest on the 7th of December last year. He's named Lufsig, shape of a wolf. The chief executive of Hong Kong, who's also the guy at whom these protests now are directed, is known for being wolf-like in the way he is seen to favour the interests of mainland China over those of the local Hong Kong populace. The character of his name is also similar to the character for wolf, but as importantly, Lufsig, the name, when transliterated into Chinese characters, in Mandarin sounds very innocuous, but in Cantonese, which is the language much more heavily spoken in Hong Kong, and which the Hong Kong locals feel is under threat, it sounds very much like your mother's genitalia. So its design, its name, all conspired together in this thing to make it this object of political dissent, which is, those are the reasons for which we've acquired it into the collection. And I think that sits as a counterbalance to the brick, where I think those types of arguments would be harder to make. Of course, the soft toy could also enter an exhibition about children's fairy tales, because he's Little Red Riding Hood or Made in Asia. There are many ways in which our objects fit into the wider activity of the museum. So umbrellas are objects that we are currently sourcing. We also tried quite hard to find something in relation to the Scottish referendum, but one of the things that we really have learned is that the objects need to jump out before the story, because we are a museum of things, we are a design museum, and that's an important distinction. We've begun this I Would Collect page on the V&A website and via social media, because as I've kind of indicated, we are very open to suggestions, but also the museum is a place of dialogue and participation. There was an interesting article in Disegno about design museums, and David Crowley, who wrote the article, called it a performative turn, whereby design museums are often, or not just design museums, but museums more broadly in the last number of years, are much more thinking toward the participation of the visitors. And I hadn't necessarily thought about it in performative terms, but it is absolutely true that we don't want people to come to the museum and feel they're being told things. It's a place to come and learn. Yes, there are facts. It's a place of knowledge and expertise, but somebody who knows something about a video game will know very much more than I, and I take that as at its expertise value. So I think with rapid response, there's also scope for suggestions. I mean, a number of them have been cakes recently, which there was a very nice one that came up out of the Scottish referendum. There was a bakery in Glasgow, which for 200 days prior to the referendum had sold yes and no cakes, and they kept a record of how many of which were sold each day. And they offered us a cupcake for the collection, and the owner very nicely said to us, the sugar content is so high that it will stay with you for quite some time. I didn't, and you know, it would have been nice, and potentially that tally, the handwritten tally, might have been something to, in material terms, to capture a record of the referendum, but in design terms, the ballot paper and its restraint and its very simple question, how the question and its language had been pulled together and deeply thought, was potentially one of those objects. I mean, there has been a lot of interest in the posters as well, because of course, with so many of these political campaigns, the graphic design is often very strong. But anyway, we haven't yet resolved what that will be. But this opening up of the dialogue around rapid response is also seen in this Tumblr, which is just very recent, Rapid Response Design, which is a group of students at the Rietveld Academy trying to apply some of the logics of rapid response to their own work. The RCA is also doing, so the Royal College of Art, a school-wide rapid response collecting workshop. And I think for me this is, I mean, of course I think it's brilliant, but I think it's heartening to think about, we are actually saying rapid response design is about an interest in the practice of design today. It's a means of bringing in mass-produced objects, it's a means of bringing in popular culture, but also the unauthored object into the museum. And there are those who are embarking on careers in the field who are looking at this activity. And there is a sense for us that some in the design world, but also more broadly, as like, this is what we've been waiting for, a real critical engagement with design practice that's finding a place within an institution that others have described as homes and gardens in 3D. And so again, it's about repositioning what we want or think a museum should be and is doing. The other thing that Rapid Response has done quite nicely for us, and again this is part of being a new team, is thinking about new modes of practice, and I think that's both curatorially but also as an institution. So in the process of developing Rapid Response, which was a means of writing papers, convincing colleagues, looking for examples, testing, we had the opportunity to work in Shenzhen. So this is the city closest to Hong Kong in mainland China, which 35 years ago was a fishing village and is now a city of 18 million. And we were there and able to test Rapid Response at the Architecture and Urbanism Biennial. So what Kieran and I did there was to invite those working and living in Shenzhen to try and apply the logic of Rapid Response to their own city. And this resulted in an exhibition, I think it was in the end 23 objects. And each one of them told a story about Shenzhen today. The yellow object that you see closest to you is a parking clamp, a wheel clamp that is if you have parked illegally. They're bought by very many private individuals. But Shenzhen is a city that has grown so fast and the buildings have just shot up without necessarily so much foresight for the shape of the city in the near future. So most of the earlier buildings have been built without foundations that can support underground parking. So as the population has gone up, car use has gone up, but there is nowhere to park. And so for this architect, this was his suggestion, a way of capturing an insight into the city. He also showed it alongside, or his suggestion was to show it alongside parking tickets, where the affluence of this city is also increasing, where the cost of a parking ticket is not enough of a deterrent to stop people parking illegally, which again shapes your interaction with this place. The thing that was interesting here is that these 23 objects created a real portrait of the city. And the sign that you see here at the top says, "Time is money, efficiency is life," which is the motto of the city. And it's an object that was found in some rubbish by a musician, and he had always treasured it. It's actually made of fiberglass and is probably not that old. I imagine it's the late 80s, hard to tell. But it's an object that says so much about a city where its inhabitants say there is no history or culture. So this is an object that we became very interested in because, of course, it was an example of those living there engaging with how their city is changing, and the saving of this sign being part of that. We went about acquiring a number of the objects for the V&A's collections, and one of the ones that we wanted to then, after the show closed, to acquire was this sign, which by the time we had expressed that interest, the mayor of the city of Shenzhen had said, no, it needs to go into the city museum. So this was an object, it was a nice full circle because we went out to Shenzhen with this idea of saying, actually, there are material things that tell you about your city. They're important, they're designed artifacts, they have a cultural value, but also have an ability to tell you about the short history of this city. And it took quite a lot of persuasion and a real direct engagement with individuals there for this show to take shape. But by the end of the 3-month process, an object was entering the collections of an institution there. So that was a great result. This is just another quick example. So just to round out, Design and Public Life is the third title that I gave to this talk today. And we often as a team, with the Contemporary Architecture, Design and Digital section, think of ourselves as a department of public life. Because public life, design, these are the two things that we are most interested in. We are firm in our belief that architecture and design shape how we live together. And it is the first stage in a series of activities that we are working on as a curatorial group. The next is an exhibition which will open in April of next year, which is All of This Belongs to You. It's a question that has, yes, the V&A, it describes us very well. We are a an institution that holds objects in public trust, but also if we do think it all belongs to us, what are our implicit responsibilities? So this exhibition at a moment when the country is going to the elections, and is it a shared point of democracy? We're all thinking about, or those who have the vote here in the UK, have an opportunity to think about our shared futures. The museum as a civic space, a public space, is a place to test out these ideas. The city, urban space, we all share it. How do we engage with it? The museum as a public, or as I've just said, is quite privileged at the moment, particularly if you begin to think that public space such as parks, playgrounds, school fields are all declining. We are actually expanding. That's quite unusual. And what does that mean for a museum? Does that mean we take on new and different responsibilities? But also it's a time to think about how design and architecture do shape our shared existence. It'll be fun. I think it's going to be a challenge. But again, it's a step further of where rapid response has begun to take us. And we hope that the museum will continue to enable us to do these things, but also that the ideas that this modest display and our other activities are addressing will begin to filter into the wider galleries and echelons of this quite large place. I realise I've talked for quite some time now, so please do ask questions. I'm not quite sure how this framework is going to happen.
I'm just going to join you here up front and then look back for people who have questions. Thank you so much.
You coming, sorry, there will be questions. You coming to sit here next to me makes me say, of course, you said, is it an exhibition or display? And I said I would come back to that, and I haven't.
I'll start with that.
I'll start with that. So it's a display because an exhibition in museum terms means that it comes to an end. Rapid response for us is an ongoing activity. And part of the design of the gallery is that its temporality is there. So each time we get a new acquisition, we swap something out or we jig things together. And so it's about hoping that our repeat visitors will come and look and keep thinking about how these objects can tell them about the world, but also that they want to come and see what we're up to, but also come and suggest. So it's a display.
I always have after such wonderful talks. I never have questions because it's so perfect and rounded and well articulated and everything is already there. And so that...
Great.
The Wolfsy example, I don't know if that was the...
Lufsy, yeah.
That's made by IKEA.
IKEA, yes.
I'm just not sure how that fits into your remit because the intentions of the manufacturer and the designer don't seem to be relevant to the reasons that you're showing that.
But I think objects circulate in the world, and you're, as an individual who might have made them, your intent for them is only indicative. Once it belongs or circulates differently, those objects very readily change.
Well, that's true, but I suppose if you're talking about design and you were saying that the collections are about design, the other examples seem to be more fitted to mould that intentions of the designer and then the kind of consequences of that.
Potentially, yes, but if you... I mean, I think there are objects, depending on how you understand rapid response collecting, that fit more closely within the remit than others. And I think if you ask the four of us who work on this, we would say that different objects are more allied or the best examples of this activity. I think if you look at, just because we've had a picture of it, the Motorola unit, which it's designed for prolonged use, it's ergonomic, you can wear it in temperatures of up to -40, that's where your ice cream is stored in a warehouse. But Motorola of Clear, I mean, you know, this is what they say, and you always look at these things with a degree of, skepticism is the wrong word, I'm not quite finding it, but you look at what you are told very, very carefully. They say, this is the unit we make. There is software that's supplied for it, or a program, a warehouse management system, that is designed and coded by somebody else, but it's actually the individual, the business, that employs that unit and decides how that unit is put into play that is shaping how it is used and for what intent, what purpose it is given. So again there, I don't think you can at any point say that the intent of the designer is fixed. So some companies incentivize their staff by using them to measure the speed and accuracy of completion. If you have a high score, you do very well. Others, if you believe what you read in the papers, use them to monitor how often you go to the loo or use the water fountain. So it is an interesting one, and I think it's a question that's quite pertinent to the V&A, because, or design museums more generally, as they are, I mean, currently understood is a difficult one because I think they're understood different, or popularly perceived about the intent of the designer being the most important part of an object. And I think it's also a narrative about design that you find very often in retail, because of course you're buying into a story when you buy an object, buy a chair. The fact that you are buying the restrained lines of mid-century modernism and you are aligning yourself with that lifestyle is already something. So what resides in an object just changes in terms of your perspective.
Another question. Georgina.
Thank you, that was great. One out of 1,000 questions, but just one. One of the things I really liked about this is how you were talking about how, because it's literally rapid response, it's at the point where this thing has been manufactured incredibly recently, it shines a light on the relationship that the V&A has to have with the company itself. But obviously there's always been politics in curating, but you have that almost real-time thing of this ad is being shown now, but it's also being shown here as well. And I was wondering, firstly, do you have any way of kind of capturing what those dynamics are, because that kind of goes into the politics of the curating as well, but also would there be a way of capturing those dynamics for things that are less recent, or is that one of the strengths of this, that you do have that kind of interesting relationship?
I think rapid response is unique in that some of those dynamics are what you see in the gallery. Any object in the V&A's collections has what is known as a registered file, and so for example with the e-cigarettes, or as we're looking at that, every piece of correspondence I've had with that firm is in that file. Every telephone conversation is noted and minuted and is in that file. But that's the case for any object in the collection, but potentially those narratives of acquisition are more interesting in these cases. So the fact that the law has had to catch up with the acquisition of the gun is arguably as important as the object, depending on your perspective. And that is within the acquisitions files, yes. But I think there's an intensified interest because these things are timely. And there is a focus on why and how we brought them in as part of the curatorial ethos.
Would you collect objects before they would be made, or before the... Can you be so rapid that you kind of intercept it?
Well, I think to date, near all the objects have had a life beyond the gallery or beyond the studio of the designer or beyond the museum. One of the objects that I didn't focus on today that potentially is slightly different in those contexts is the Kone Ultra Rope, which is this, there isn't even a term to describe this thing. It's a lift hoisting mechanism. It's not a mechanism, it's a material innovation that enables a lift to travel up to 1,000 meters in height, as opposed to the current restriction, which is about 500 meters. A very basic whistle-stop lifts go up and down on woven steel cables. They and the machinery become very heavy, which means currently lifts, the most lifts, do not go above 500 meters. Kone have developed this new lift hoisting mechanism. It's a cable in effect, but it's carbon, I want to say this right, fiber tubes that are embedded in a resistant epoxy, a plastic type barrier. It means that the lift can go up 1,000 meters. It means that you might not have as many transfer floors, the speed is different, it's more environmentally sound. You know, there are lots of reasons that Kone say it's brilliant. But it is, for us, interesting because, of course, we're in an increasingly urbanised world. If this does mean that lifts are changing, does that mean our cityscapes will change? Like the lift in the first instance brought about the skyscraper, is this a sea change in lift mechanics? We acquired that object, or became very interested in it at point of its launch. So the company based in Finland had been testing this for more than 10 years. They launched it onto the market, but there is no lift yet that goes 1,000 metres. So the answer is yes, but it's still something that has a market viability.
It's my favourite company name. It means machine in Finnish.
It's rather nice.
Kone.
They, I mean, it's also a good one to talk about, a bit like the Louboutin shoes. On the train on the way down, the gentleman was asking me, what are you beavering away around? What are you writing so furiously? And I was saying I was coming to talk about rapid response collecting. And he goes, oh, yes, okay. And then I mentioned a number of the objects. He goes, oh, aren't they all a bit gritty? And I was like, well, it is one of the things that has been remarked upon in this activity, and it speaks to this idea that the sinister demands attention just as much as the beautiful. But there is a balance that needs to be struck, and it comes back to this politics. I mean, some of us have said, some of our critics have said, but also some of our peers, and I think there is absolute truth to it, that in the selection of objects you can read a certain politics. At no point am I or we saying we want to address these certain issues. It's just that these objects have come to the fore. But when you bring them together in the round, mass manufacture, working conditions, building regulations, labour law, they do come to the fore. But then you can also say, actually, if you look at the objects that we have, that we've collected in this last year, what the digital has enabled or has changed is also there. But particularly if you're looking at the press, the kind of sinister or the digital possibility, they're different levels of newsworthiness. And inevitably, because there is a slight journalistic bent to the activity, it has found quite a lot of resonance with our journalistic friends and colleagues.
But then again, we're not living in the happiest of times. So
absolutely not. Personally, I think museums are not there to solely celebrate design, and as we are not there to acquire things and therefore make the careers of individuals. So we need to indeed think about design in its widest sense, but also the public realm in its widest sense. And again, thinking of public squares being under threat, you're more able to protest in the V&A than you are outside Parliament. And so there are different ways to think about what we are up to, and these things should be part of museum discourse.
I saw at least 2 hands.
What you've just said, I totally agree with you, because I was just thinking it's a very broad remit, because you've got international, you've got kind of things that are kind of public domain, things that are, consumerism and things, I mean, it's fascinating. But I just wonder whether there's a point where you kind of go, well, that's what we're doing, or maybe it's not quite like that, I mean, I have got stuff in the V&A, I feel quite proud, because how old I am, but I've got in the digital art collection as well, the Just Dogs. So, I mean, I've been involved, and I'm fascinated by the collections of things, and the metadata was interesting about how the collection that you've collected, you have this other level of how it happened as well. It's fascinating. So I don't think it was a question. I just think, I don't know, the question is, where do the parameters start? And maybe you don't have one.
Where are the parameters around contemporary design? What is design practice today? I think those are things that we are still debating and looking at closely. So to say where rapid response begins and ends is also quite difficult. I mean, we are architecture and urbanism design and digital, but in today's world there's a very broad terms. Inevitably the kind of museumness and the national institutionness of us comes out. Like, we recently began to think about stamps. Tom of Finland has just been celebrated, and
the most successful stamp in the history of Finland.
Exactly, and we are just about to bring it into rapid response. But we were like, stamps. Is that does that fall within the remit of the V&A? Because the national institutions have agreements as to who collects what. Like, the V&A won't collect sculpture after. What's the word I'm looking for? 20th century, because that sits with Tate. And coins are at the British Museum. And then I was like, coins, stamps, where does that... And then you begin to explore your own collections. And yes, we don't collect stamps actively, but because we have the theatre and performance collections, they have commemorative stamps that mark, I don't know, Elvis Presley or somebody else. And so there's a precedent, so we begin to think, actually, yes, these stamps, Tom of Finland, are important, and there is a reason to bring them into our collection.
Sorry, love, everything Finnish is collected here.
It would appear so. Yes, stay away.
That was a question.
Hi, so Rosie from Culture 24.
Hi.
This is really interesting. You've spoken a lot about the response in the media, and obviously you can track online responses to the collections and things. But if your displays are in this area that people just pass through, how do you sort of monitor the conversations that people are having in front of the cases?
It's a really good question, because we earwig, absolutely, yes. But it's something that I think we need to spend some time and attention on. The museum as a broader whole does do a lot of visitor surveys and observation, and I would like to think that some of that is targeted at rapid response. Some of the overhearing is really rich. This happened even before the gallery had opened. So immediately before the display was opening, we, as I'm sure if you work in these in curatorial ways, we had paper cutouts of our objects, and we were placing them in the space to see how they might fit and whether we wanted the mobile phone next to the shoes or elsewhere. And so we had a tiny little cutout piece of paper that was a mobile phone with Flappy Bird on it. And we had this school group walking through, and this little boy, they were under 10, was pulling his friends and his teacher back to go and look at this paper cutout of a mobile phone. And for me, that was a really important moment to realise that actually this mobile phone game, it's what somebody's wearing, what somebody's reading, what somebody is enjoying at the time, and being able to connect so directly within the museum to those objects and having a deeper, longer engagement with those things. Like his question was, why is that in the museum? And then you can begin to talk about the change in mobile gaming, this particular one being very addictive, how it came to be that this designer in Hanoi who coded it over a weekend came to take this game down from Google and Apple because he was receiving death threats because of the social unacceptability of games addiction. That's a long narrative, but just a moment to see actually the thing that I play on when I'm travelling to school is in this museum. That's meaningful to me. That might make me more interested. It will make me look at that thing differently. So it's not exactly an answer to what you're asking. But again, I think the interest from the universities and school groups is something that's a means of understanding better about the activity. But I think there is a difference between understanding the impact that you can have within the museum, with your peers and colleagues and in the press, and with your visitors. I think that if you did do some earwigging, you would find quite a number of the V&A visitors saying, Primark? And still being quite surprised that that sits alongside Christian Louboutin in the case next door, but also alongside a wedding dress exhibition just one floor below. Hi.
Hello. Recently here at Lighthouse we had an exhibition called News Tweak, and it's kind of on the premise of the kind of interpretation of fact and debate and the exaggeration that sometimes happens in the media, and I'm just really interested in how you go about that initial kind of research and what kind of channels that you use to kind of predict the fair debate that is happening.
There are a number of, and as I said, rapid response is a learning curve. There are a number of objects around which we could talk about that. But the thing for me personally, but I think also for us as a team and also for the wider museum, it's the first time that I've worked on an exhibition where I have consistently been asked if my labels have been legaled. And I was like, legaled? Have your lawyers checked the labels? And I was like, no. I've done my fact checking. I did it assiduously after that. So to come back to the Katy Perry eyelashes, they are, as I said, made by women in Indonesia. They're knotted by hand. So Gethin Chamberlain is an investigative journalist, and he wrote a piece that appeared both in The Sun and The Observer about the working conditions of the women that make false eyelashes. And he spoke specifically about the Katy Perry eyelashes. this was the story, or these were the narratives that brought and sparked our interest in that object. Again, post the kind of public announcement of the display opening, ILAW got in touch with us to dispute or question very much of what Gethin Chamberlain was saying. So you've got a manufacturer and a journalist with very different perspectives. We're an institution in the middle, and where do we stand? And then it was a process of really interrogating the facts. ILAW is an incredible company. It's a firm that's been around since the 40s in the UK. It has a very historic tradition. And we have makeup in the collection. We begin to look at the wider narratives about eyelashes, false eyelashes. We look at them as an object within a specialist field. But also, we seek in what we do to represent both voices. And you will see this correspondence in the object file if you go and request that, and they're all publicly accessible. But in the label, we went through a number of versions of it to make absolutely clear, as we did with all of them, that what we are including alongside those objects is fact, as opposed to interpretation or misrepresentation. And we learnt very soon that for rapid response, particularly at the outset, it's really important that the manufacturers of the objects we're acquiring or the designers are aware that we are doing it prior to them going on display. That's for information as opposed to for right of refusal, but it is a good and cautionary thing to do. I mean, we do it anyway because, of course, as an institution that's interested in the design process of how things are made, speaking to those who make them is a critical aspect of our understanding of that object. But with rapid response, and it comes back to your neighbour's question about not necessarily having come to the object through the designer. It may come as a surprise to the designer that we're acquiring the object. I mean, Silke Loeffler, who designed Lufzig, is thrilled that her soft toy is in the V&A. But it is really important to let those individuals know, for good and for bad, but it also means that often the objects are given to us. I mean, we are a public institution. Yes, we're collecting things that are often of modest value, and because they're mass-produced, it often gives us the opportunity to be given them. And so that's another reason why we are so regularly in touch with those who make them. It has its pros and cons, but it's an important part of the collection process.
There's quite a lot you can show and can't get hold of.
Yes.
How do you deal with that? Because I was just thinking of what would I, going to the question, what would I add to? And it's Stuxnet, it's the drone interface control software.
Yes,
it's
the immaterial.
It's Prism.
Yes, so I think there are two things about what we can't show. There are things that we cannot get hold of, but there are also things that aren't so easily exhibitable or collectible. And I think Flappy Bird is that we have appointed Louise Shannon as our curator of digital, and these are a number of the issues that she and her peer group across the museum world are addressing. How do you collect the digital? And so Flappy Bird is a mobile phone app. We've collected the file. We thought very hard about how do we exhibit that. So we've bought 2 mobile phones that are the types of phones that you would play this game on, so that it's a true interface, but they're not objects. So
Android and iPhone then?
No, we just have Android actually. But because those phones are not objects, we don't have a responsibility to maintain them and upkeep them going forward at present. So how useful or valuable is that? But the thing that for me on that is, yes, we've got the file. So we had to speak to the designer, but also to Google, because there are quite a lot of rules and regulations about ownership showing these things in a public space, that if you're using the Android platform pertain to your design. And there was this wonderful moment which throws this out quite nicely, is when we approached Google, they said, you need to send a fax. And we were like, why on earth is that the case? And this is ludicrous. They're trying to put us on a false trail. But of course, it's a legal question, and a fax, because it's a material thing, is a legally binding document. But it was just so interesting when you're thinking of Google. In the end, we went through a different channel because we didn't have a fax that worked. yes, how Prism, all of these things
Yeah.
are difficult issues. One of the objects that, as an acquisition, that I have been pursuing for the longest period of time since joining the museum is The Guardian had a set of hard drives that were destroyed by GCHQ, or at the request of GCHQ and the Guardian offices last year. And for me, these are objects that we so often struggle to exhibit, the digital. But these are objects that so immediately communicate the struggle between the hardware and the virtual worlds. Like, who has ownership of those? The hard drives were destroyed in the full knowledge of all parties that there were files elsewhere, but it was still important to eradicate that information. And so that, for me, is one of those objects that can begin to address these kind of intangible things. But we as curators and our documentations and collections teams, who are responsible for the databases and the systems through which we collect, we absolutely need to get up to speed as to how we collect these other things. But then there's the collection process, but also there's the exhibition question. And they're things that are ever changing.
In terms of your acquisitions, I mean, it seems like collecting things, the design that is relevant and significant now, but do you also have an eye for what will be relevant and significant in years to come, and how do you determine that?
There's two ways to answer that question. We're collecting things now because we think they will be relevant to future researchers. I mean, if you look at the V&A as a place that has collected for 150 years and its engagement with the contemporary, there have been times when there has been a 50-year rule in place whereby the museum wouldn't collect anything that was newer than 50 years because it was felt that the passage of time was needed to establish whether something was valuable enough to come into the collections or not. And so in some ways, my answer to your question is we're collecting the here and now because we hope it will be and we think it will be interesting to future researchers. Whether we're acquiring things that are speculative or future-facing, not as part of rapid response, and it's not one of the current focuses of our team, but that said, we are likely to be working towards an exhibition about the future, and where something like that might come in. In so many ways, the design of today is such a big subject already. But I think what rapid response might show you is that something like the Kone Ultra Rope, that is a signal to the future, but it's a material thing of today. I haven't acquired anything yet that is of the future.
Maybe that's a really nice ending. Should we just give another applause and have a drink?